Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Josh Shapiro. I'm a partner here at Thompson Hine's Antitrust Practice Group. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the fourth in a series of webinars hosted by Thompson Hine's ESG Collaborative that will address how the increasingly important ESG element of modern business can factor into transactions, long-term strategies, business operations, and disclosures for all types of companies. Before we begin, I'd like to just address a few housekeeping items. First, today's program is being recorded and we will send a link to all attendees within 48 hours of today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located in the control box on the right side of your screen to submit any questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We will be offering CLE credit for today's webinar. Please be sure to complete the online survey confirming your attendance at today's program. You can find the link in the agenda, which can be downloaded from the handouts tab. We also will be sharing the link in the chat at the conclusion of the program when we read the CLE code. In that handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios of today's speakers. Again, thank you for your interest, and if you have any questions as we go along, please use the question box. I'm delighted now to introduce Corby Bauman, my partner here at Thompson Hine's corporate practice, and Mike Armstrong, who's president of AGAS Americas. As you can see everyone on the screen and in your video box above, nice parallels there. But today, really what we're going to do is we're going to go over, provide an overview of ESG, some of the recent developments in the corporate landscape, and particularly pressure from companies participating in corporate America to perhaps engage in ESG initiatives, and with that, perhaps ESG collaborations, and discuss sort of the antitrust implications thereof. I'd like to turn it over right now to Corby, who's going to sort of walk us through the sort of where things stand today in ESG, and near the end we'll get to some recent examples as well as some best practices.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. Thanks everybody for attending. Welcome. As Josh said, my name is Corby Bauman. I'm a corporate partner in Thompson Hine's New York office. All of you, I'm sure, have heard about ESG. Even if you've tried to avoid it, I'm sure you can't avoid it. It's not new. It's something that we have heard about for years, but I think the way that we're talking about it and the focus on ESG matters has changed a bit. Just to go back and give a little brief history, ESG issues were mentioned in 2006 at the UN's Principle of Responsible Investment report, looking at asset managers and investors and asking them to sign on to some minimum requirements relating to environmental, social, and governance issues. Further, in 2011, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board began to develop standards to display sustainability and financial fundamentals, really allowing investors, when they look at investment opportunities, to compare performance on social and environmental issues in particular. As we've moved forward, in April of 2021, the European Commission adopted proposals for corporate sustainability reporting, including sustainability reporting standards. These, once adopted by member countries, could be applicable to all sorts of what they refer to as undertakings within the EU, which is broad. It basically means business being conducted and economic activity consisting of goods or services in a particular market that touches upon the European Union. These efforts have really expanded the breadth and scope of what we're talking about. As most of you are likely aware, the SEC proposed in March of 2022 that there would be rule changes relating to registrants. Those are companies that have registered securities with the SEC that would be required to make certain climate-related disclosures in their registration statements and their periodic reports. The focus of these requirements were largely on figuring out how to really use metrics to assess exposure to risks, also to be able to quantify what those risks are, whether that's in a dollar value or some other magnitude, and also be able to track how companies are doing on their own internal climate-related metrics in order to review what their progress has been. So with all of this, the scope and breadth is really different in how we're talking about this. Industries in all areas and locations are being touched by these ESG matters. Really, what does ESG mean? I think that's part of what we're still trying to figure out. Obviously, the different regulatory bodies and regulations have different views of what ESG is and the ESG criteria is. But just in terms of looking at what this means for your average business, if you're not registered with the SEC, then you don't really necessarily have to comply with that broad framework. However, we are thinking that as things move forward, there's going to be other regulations, whether those are state or local, or demands that are placed on other companies from investors, employees, customers, and the community. Similar to how in the past 10 years, we've seen a really rapid increase in the number of companies that are asking their suppliers to sign suppliers' codes of conduct, which are a voluntary undertaking to comply with certain requirements that that supplier is looking for. We expect this to happen with ESG. We expect ESG issues to become a focus of not only the public markets, but also private lenders, private consumers, and also customers and suppliers. Looking at the topics that get focused on, just to give sort of a broad perspective of what's included here. Environmental matters are included, human capital management, ESG targets and goals, including environmental goals and sustainability goals, corporate culture, board oversight of environmental and social issues, social impact and community matters, issues in shareholder engagement relating to sustainability and environmental matters, and also looking at climate change. There's a number of recent examples that we can think about in companies that have ESG related matters that are being reported upon. Just in thinking about some current examples, these range from thinking about Starbucks with their worker unionization activities and their initiatives to use reusable cups. Recently, Hess Corporation announced its purchase of carbon credits in Guyana to support the rainforests. BlackRock announced the acquisition of a global solar mounting systems company. And also Samsung recently announced it's teaming up with Patagonia to reduce microplastics and stop them from going into our oceans by creating new washing machines designed to minimize the effects of microplastics. All of these are really ESG. They may be different parts of ESG, and they may touch on multiple areas of environmental, social, and governance issues, but they're all ESG. So why are we talking about ESG and antitrust? That's a good question. It's not something you would typically think of, but as we go into looking at ESG and how it applies to different companies, one of the things we have to look at is industry initiatives. ESG is a focus of the Biden administration, as is antitrust, and there's a bit of a tension there that we'll explore further in this webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk a bit about the ESG pressures that he's seeing in his industry.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Good afternoon, Mike Armstrong. I'm the president of AGAS in the Americas. AGAS is a global refrigerant management company. We've been around for about 30 years. We operate in 25 countries around the world. The United States is one of our largest markets, and for many of the folks on the call, we're probably directly or indirectly supplying some of the products that you use in your own industry. So the big distinction for the refrigerant industry is the products that we deal with are incredibly highly intense global warming gases. A pound of these products is worth about 1 to 10 tons of CO2e, and those are things that all of us on this call are thinking about from a scope 1 and in some cases a scope 3 standpoint. But for our industry, one of the things that's really characterized how ESG and antitrust needs to be thought of in the same sentence is the amount of rulemaking that's going on to support, for our industry, the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol. That is driving the phase down of refrigerants in the United States and around the world. And what comes with it is an incredible amount of rulemaking. The first of that started in 2019 with the state of California, where they are mandating the use of reclaimed refrigerants in systems that are being used over the next couple years, and that will continue to accelerate on the West Coast. And then we have the AIM Act, which just went into effect here at the beginning of the year, which is basically the implementation of the Kigali Amendment. And in the United States, that means we'll phase down the use of virgin refrigerants from 300 million tons of product here this year to 45 million tons. So an 85% reduction over the next 14 years of these global warming gases. Each of these rulemakings requires really extensive engagement with government to ensure that the phase down can be supported both by industry, which is where the antitrust concerns start to come in, but then they can actually be effective and understand the impact to the consumers. So what will that mean for all of us on the call? In the next 5 years, regardless of whether you just bought a new air conditioning system, you're probably going to have to buy another one because the gases are being phased down, and that will have a massive impact on consumers, but it will drive the economy into low GWP products. Excuse me. From an industrial standpoint, it's a bit more aggressive, where the state of California and the EPA are starting to impose refrigerant limits, which is really going to target companies in their scope one emissions by forcing the change out of systems. But the governments don't necessarily know exactly how to do this, and they turn to industry to kind of look for recommendations on how should they write the rules and how can they make those effective and implementable so there's not problems down the road. In a lot of cases, my business will engage with a very small number of us will engage directly with the US EPA and with CARB in California to help them understand what are the capabilities of industry. But we do find ourselves in a number of cases where, and in our industry, there's 25 reclaimers of significance. We find ourselves in the case where it is required to, in some cases, lobby together to the government as they start to think about how rulemaking comes into play. And that's where the antitrust concerns come in, because we do want to make sure that we're getting the government what they need to help make rules, but also making sure that the rules we're proposing are pro-competitive. So we are one of Thompson Hine's clients, and we spend a lot of time collaborating to make sure that the engagements we have are compliant. You know, they keep the company, you know, out of hot water, not only from an antitrust issue to make sure that the rulemaking is fair for consumers and for competitors in our industry, but also this is an industry that will go through a level of consolidation over the next 10 years. And we want to make sure that, you know, we never have any issues as a business that, you know, we're on the wrong side of this to prevent our company from potentially growing in the marketplace. So I thought it'd be a pretty nice example of how the things that Josh and Corby are talking about are sort of seen and explored by trade in the current marketplace.
I think that's sort of a good segue into sort of how, you know, what's taking a step back, what's the analytical framework under which we sort of identify and look at ESG collaborations? Because as Mike mentioned, when the government looks to industry for solutions, industry sometimes has to, as a sort of, there's no way around it but to collaborate to give the government the solutions, particularly when the government's asking for them. So what happens? Well, number one, I think it's important to note that, you know, anytime, and this is sort of any, you know, this is the advice we give to all of our clients, anytime you're interacting with your competitors, there is some level of antitrust risk. You know, there's a tendency to think a little Pollyanishly that, you know, if you're sort of pursuing noble goals such as ESG, or let's say a climate initiative, that, you know, somehow you're shielded from antitrust liability. Unfortunately, that's not the case. As the last Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Antitrust Division said, the loftiest of purported motivations does not excuse anti-competitive collusion among rivals. So again, and that sort of goes back to the, you know, how we've sort of titled this presentation, "No Good Deed Goes Unpunished," and that's really true in terms of antitrust. So let's say you're, you know, companies getting together to talk with the government. You know, there's some protections. There's a doctrine called the Noor-Pennington Doctrine, which protects the petitioning, joint petitioning of the government. So lobbying or talking about legislation. But even within that context and established safe harbors such as North Pennington, companies can still run afoul of the antitrust laws. Again, the antitrust laws don't go away because Section 1 of the Sherman Act, as you can see here, in broad strokes, it makes unlawful agreements on unreasonably restrained trade, agreements among two competitors or two participants in the supply chain. They could be competitors, they could be suppliers and customers. As long as they're independent competitors, Section 1 applies. So in terms of how you would look at an agreement among competitors, just again, we'll talk a little more about ESG and specifically, but how would these agreements be looked at? So obviously, if you're involved in ESG collaboration, the biggest concern is the potential of getting your competitors together to talk about perhaps ESG, and then suddenly the conversation shifts to talking about output or restrictions on capacity or price or price fixing. And there's some areas of some agreements which are considered per se unlawful. And what this means is that there is no justification whatsoever. These are also such as price fixing, bid rigging. These are antitrust agreements that are unlawful in the antitrust laws that actually can potentially carry criminal penalties as well. So beyond civil penalties and lawsuits, you could have a DOJ investigation and criminal fines and imprisonment. So again, even if you're dealing with sort of very noble goals, you're like I have here, sort of rolling out green products, or agreeing on prices of something, or agreeing to sunset perhaps certain products as an industry, that's potential antitrust violation. So even if we're not in the sort of price fixing or restriction on output, anything that would be considered in the per se unlawful category, we still have to think about whether the agreement itself could be deemed anti-competitive because it sort of decreases the ability or incentive of firms to raise prices or reduce output. So essentially reduces innovation, reduces service quality, reduces, ultimately has a detrimental effect on the economy. So that would be under what we call the rule of reason. It's less restrictive. It's not a per se rule, obviously, but still, you don't want to be in a position where you're defending your agreement with the Department of Justice, even under rule of reason. That's just sort of an area you don't want to get involved with. I think so putting this in the context of ESG, where are we, and sort of where has ESG popped up? Now, ESG obviously is a somewhat recent phenomenon, so there's not a ton of precedent here, but there are some notable ones. Number one, I have here, there was a probe. This is on the tail end of the Trump administration. So Makem Delrahim was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Antitrust Division. The DOJ brought or launched an investigation into automakers who essentially agreed with the state of California to adhere to emission standards that were much stricter than those being sought by the federal government. Now, there are potential ways to pick apart and poke holes in the sort of the theories behind this investigation, because again, it was sort of under the auspices literally with the state of California, and whether or not they could, these automakers could conspire with the state of California. Putting that aside, and perhaps the political motivations of this, because again, it was, there's a sort of, I think the Trump administration was certainly against, viewed the automakers, and in this context, in particular the state of California, and rules are stricter than the federal government, as something that they were against. The theory here is that this agreement essentially limited the types of cars and trucks that would be offered. So ultimately, the investigation was dropped, I should say, but this created a whole whirlwind of potential legal risk for the automakers. We have, if folks read the New York Times, you might have seen recently that there was a raid in Europe in the fashion industry. So essentially, the European Commission is carrying out dawn raids, which is sort of unannounced, literally at the crack of dawn, knocking on doors of fashion houses in Europe. And so these fashion houses are coming together in the auspices of reducing environmental waste and carbon emissions. And there is concern among the European Commission. Again, there's nothing proven yet. These are all allegations. This is sort of being worked out in the investigatory phase, but that essentially that these are turning into climate cartels. Then that's the concern. So again, whether that is happening in the US right now, we don't know. Whether there's similar investigations, we have not heard of those yet. But I think people believe that those will be coming soon. Again, these are all sort of under the sort of no good deed goes unpunished. I think the intentions behind these probes are noble, if you will. But again, the effect of them are that you're getting competitors in the room together, and the conduct could ultimately end up in prices being raised or output being reduced. There also was recently several senators, Republican senators, including the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as well as the Antitrust Committee. So Chuck Grassley and Senator Mike Lee sent a letter to a number of U.S. law firms, and they essentially warning them, and sent this specifically to the ESG practice group leaders, warning them, that they should be informing their clients of the risk that ESG initiatives sort of essentially are enabling climate cartels. Those are the words of the senators. Again, you could maybe assail the motives of Chuck Grassley and Mike Lee, and it's clear where their view lies. Again, there's the letter essentially is protecting to some degree the oil and gas industry, or saying, look, these ESG initiatives are targeting oil and gas industry, but still the general takeaway here is that it is true that ESG and antitrust are not entirely compatible. So, just under the guise of reducing investments, or for instance, banks, reducing investments in oil and gas industry, to the extent they're agreeing to do so with their competitors, that's problematic. I'm going to turn to some best practices. So in terms of what you can do as a company in whatever industry you're in, your sort of first principle here should be always act independently. Again, that's rule number one for any company doing business. Unilateral decision making, particularly with pricing or output strategy in competitive decisions, is always what you should be doing. Essentially, you should be working with your competitors with respect to pricing, output, or any competitive decisions. That said, you can't be involved in industry in this country without occasionally dealing with your competitors in some form or capacity, whether that's in an industry group, a trade association, or perhaps an ESG initiative like this. But before meeting with your competitors, again, it's important to consult counsel, number one. Particularly go in with a written agenda, which you stick to. That's important. Don't get off track. Record your minutes. Avoid any sort of side meetings or side discussions among participating companies. And if possible, and this isn't always practicable, but if possible, you should be including counsel in your meetings. Again, this doesn't happen every time, but that's our general advice: include counsel in meetings. And I think we have to think through, the sort of the main thing that you shouldn't be exchanging, again, is compellingly sensitive information, and that's really, generally speaking, prices, volumes, cost details, strategic or marketing plans. If you're going to plan to enter or exit a geographic or product market, that's a compellingly sensitive information. If this is something you normally in the ordinary course wouldn't share with your competitor, you shouldn't be sharing it in an industry meeting or an ESG meeting, to the extent you're having ESG initiatives. There's also a concern too about certification, ESG certification. Again, our sort of general counsel is that your best bet in terms of ESG initiatives are to go it alone. But if you have to do it within an industry setting, you have to be careful, because again, there are issues with standard setting organizations in antitrust, particularly if those standard settings somehow end up discriminating against other competitors. So again, that's sort of where we fit, in terms of antitrust and ESG. And I think, Mike, I would just ask you, where do you see in the next few years, you see with the rise of legislation in your industry and rulemaking, do you see there'll be more pressure for collaboration with your competitors in that sense? Just even pure response, because I look at some of the carbon setting rules, and I just don't see how one company can even determine how to comply with that without understanding where the industry is headed.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think number one is the attention and the focus on the ESG and the commitments that have already been made are probably not enough to reach the goals that we're trying to reach through the Paris Climate Accords. So that's 1.5C. I just see it getting more aggressive. I think we're going to see it with more pressure on companies, more solutions from governments, and governments acting alone. So it's not just California anymore. It's Washington, it's Hawaii, it's New York. And so being able to understand and navigate both the federal piece, but also the state piece is going to be really aggressive. I mean, this is probably, over the next 2 years, will probably have the biggest impact in our industry. And, the industry is not even sure if we can accomplish it. So if the government's already put a marker out there that's going to be tough to deliver, it will only drive more collaboration, because the government will need more solutions. They'll need more alignment with industry on what are the things we can decarbonize, what are the things that will need a bit of a pass on, and then the government will need to check and make sure that we're not pulling their leg, because that's the other part about industry is it's the fox in the hen house. So I think it only intensifies. I mean, it's been a whirlwind over the last 12 months with rulemaking, and there's no less than 15 over the next 18 months that lots of industry has to contend with.
Are you finding that regulators are actually expecting that sort of collaboration? Are they asking for it?
They are asking for it. I mean, in our space, it's the last phase down was around R22, and so that's the old refrigerant in a lot of home air conditioning systems and ice rinks. It was a little easier, a little more intuitive than the current phase down with 15 or 16 different chemicals. But I think the government is looking, and they're welcoming industry to sort of show up and provide the feedback, and they are looking for some consensus. So anytime that we go and engage with the EPA individually, they not only want to hear it from my company's lens, but they also want to hear it from other competitors, other similarly situated competitors, to understand, are these trends that not only AGAS can help support, but maybe AGAS and many other competitors in the space before they start to set the bar. Because the last thing the government wants to do is set the bar on any sort of regulation where only a few companies can participate and the rest of them are stuck. That's not good for the industry, and that's not good for pro-competitive behavior in the marketplace.
I mean, you mentioned this, you alluded to this before, but when the government's setting, phase down and, recommendations or not recommendations, but rules, and, how much of particular, for instance, you need to have reclaimed refrigerants. How are they able to set those without understanding industry capacity, and where are those numbers coming from? Because essentially you have to collaborate with the government, collaborate with your competitors to at least come up with a ballpark, but it's also a sort of balancing act where you don't, from a competitive standpoint, even putting aside antitrust, you don't want your competitors to know your capacity as well. So, but to come up with those industry numbers, I assume is a challenge for everyone.
Well, in some cases, the government just guesses. And they say, hey, will this work? But then they kind of circle back to industry and start to get some consensus around, what would. In our industry, it's about the amount of virgin that can be put into a reclaimed product and still call it reclaimed. And that's something I think every company in industry is going to have to figure out, because by way of the numbers, we're all going to need to purchase reclaimed product, and we're all going to need to put our hand on our heart to say, this is really reclaimed product. And there are no definitions, and there still aren't definitions at the federal level. But there's a lot of work with California, sort of with CAFE standards. If you remember those from a few years back, California will drive the federal government to do the things that sometimes gridlock prevents us from doing. California will probably help us get there. So defining those is important, and I think getting consensus from lots of different players in the industry is something we'll start to see more of.
And are you finding pressure from, even if you're not an SEC regulated company, the fact that you do business with SEC companies. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the sort of how ESG in terms of federal rulemaking affects you?
Yeah, so AGAS is a portfolio company of KKR. They've been fantastic partners in our investment cycle, and KKR is a publicly traded company. So the same requirements that they have, whether it's a holding company or not, they really ensure that, we're doing all the same things we need to be doing as if we were an SEC listed business. But look, as a relatively large reclaimer and having relatively large customers, it's not uncommon to see that, we are very much supporting our customers' initiatives to make sure that questions around antitrust activity or debottlenecking processes or greenwashing concerns around ESG. That's a big touch point in our industry. Our customers want to make sure they've got the right solution. They want an ethical, supply base, and we're pulled into that. I mean, we could argue that we don't have to do it, but the reality is we probably all need to do a bit more of this because we're all going to be asked to chip in a bit more to work on climate change.
Corby, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see ESG going in the next couple of years in terms from the corporate compliance standpoint and SEC reporting, and sort of where the rulemaking is and where you think it's going to go.
Sure. Well, I mean, where we are now is we're obviously waiting for the final SEC rules, which it's kind of anyone's guess as to whether or not they will come out anytime soon. My personal opinion is that they will not come out for probably 6 months or so. Just based on the amount of commentary and feedback. There are a lot of things that I think need to be worked out in terms of guidance about how people are thinking about the various categories of reporting and measuring and calculations. If we're using different calculations and different standards for those calculations, it's not going to be that useful tool to measure one company against another in terms of their sustainability initiatives. I do think, as Mike alluded to, that you're going to see continued pressure from all areas, whether that's in your supply chain, your customer base, your equity holders for private companies and public companies, about really looking at what you're doing as a company, both in terms of sustainability and, sort of environmental, which we've been talking about for a while, but more of the softer issues too around social issues and governance issues and how those play out. I think there's going to be an increased focus on human capital, which we've seen from the SEC in terms of how people are treating their workers, what their workforce looks like, and just what they're doing in terms of stress upon that workforce, whether it's dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic or something else similar. In terms of sort of from a larger deal-making perspective, I spend a fair amount of time on M&A matters. And I think one of the things that we need as a group of M&A professionals to do is really start thinking about antitrust in the context of ESG and not necessarily just about competition. We need to start asking questions about what are potential targets doing in terms of collaborating? What are they doing on their own for ESG metrics, probably including some ESG related due diligence exercises, as well as even expanding the representations and warranties that are given to include things that are on, sort of the spectrum of ESG items.
Yeah, and I would say, there's been some question whether ESG is going to be a topic in merger investigations. And I think as you sort of alluded to, Corby, whether or not that will be something that is involved in one of the due diligence questions. There again, there's a concern, or at least there's at least a thought that the antitrust agencies are going to start asking ESG related questions in their merger investigations, and the question is whether that's whether that has a material impact on the merger review or not remains to be seen. Because right now, again, the way the government looks at mergers, whether or not a company does ESG is sort of irrelevant, unless they sort of change the wholesale the consumer price and sort of standard of the way they look at mergers, whether the merger is going to make prices go up reduce output. That hasn't changed yet, but if it does, then ESG is going to be a relevant criteria. But I think what's interesting is that in the course of a merger investigation, for instance, if a company is involved in a second request, it's a very extensive document, a chance for the government to essentially get an open book into the company, see what's going on, look at your internal documents. And if you go back into cartels of the past, and again, this is not ESG related cartels, but a lot of cartels have been discovered during the course of merger investigations because of documents that have shown up popped up in a second request that have been produced. And the government sees it and starts asking questions, and cartels have sort of been come out from the darkness during the course of those merger investigations. So suddenly you have a merger, and then now you're dealing not just with the civil merger portion of the DOJ, you're dealing then with the criminal attorneys.
It's certainly an indirect. Yeah, it's certainly an indirect way to get information about things that probably would not otherwise be discussed. Yeah. And I think even if they haven't asked the questions yet, just the idea that there's chatter that those questions are going to be asked is something that we all kind of need to prepare for, particularly looking at the analysis that's done on each party when they're thinking about doing the deal and kind of what they've looked into from an ESG perspective.
Well, we're now going to begin the Q&A session. We're going to address as many questions as we can in time remaining. But before we start, if you're seeking CLE for today's program, I want to provide the tracking code. And the tracking code is THAT42. Again, the tracking code is THAT42. The link to the attendance confirmation form is being placed in the chat box. If you have any additional questions after today's webinar, you can feel free to email or call Corby or me. If you're not a current Thompson Hine client, we can obviously talk with you and discuss any options to address your needs. I'm going to monitor I do not see any questions yet, so we will give you a moment to lodge any questions. Now's a good time to do so. Again, if you're seeking CLE for today's program, the tracking code is THAT42. Again, the tracking code is THAT42. I don't see any questions, but again, we are available as questions arise, so please do not hesitate to ask. Reach out directly to us. Again, thank you for your interest in attending today's webinar. Additional webinars in the ESG series are being planned, so please stay tuned. We'll send out information as it becomes available. So enjoy the rest of your day and stay well.